Let's talk about those global dimensions. I want to talk about there's many different components of Corona, but Corona's already hit the third world, and I want to, in some ways, I would like to retrieve that term. I mean, third world's origins are actually very positive and self-defined, and if those goals had been achieved, we'd live in a radically better world today. But whatever, being that as it may.
I agree.
I agree. Yeah, so maybe we can somehow get that back in the mix. But it has already had very significant impact, of course, and areas that rely on travel and tourism and economic activity like anywhere else. Actually, also particularly in South Africa, you could see a lot of extreme police violence with regards to a very vicious enforcement of both the lockdown, but also still doing evictions. And I would read Will Shockey in Africa as a country talking about that. But there's also the effects on global health networks, how this is going to affect debt, food production, food prices. I mean, there's a lot in the mix here. And in the same way as you always do, you can take us through the history. So when we look, at the developing world in general, and maybe we could focus on the continent. What is the role? First of all, where are we at now, broadly speaking, with COVID? And then, if you could take us through the imperial, colonial, and neo-colonial history of how that forms and impacts things like public health networks.
Okay, very good. So, in terms of the raw statistics, I think the total infection rate is 600 and almost 30,000, right? On a continent of 1.2 billion people. And the death rate is 13,780 total, which is even New York City alone.
Right.
Has more, almost 23,000.
So it's some very good management happening, yeah.
But I think the impact is going to be measured in a different way in Africa. It's going to be some of the things that you outlined as you were introducing this segment. The issues of debt, right? The issues, basically the economic impact, the economic ramification. You have dependent economies, right? Economies that have a certain role in the global economic system as functionaries to make the industrialized parts of the globe function more successfully and create more wealth for people in the industrialized countries. And that's how it was set up in 1884, the Berlin Conference, when the major European powers of the day met in Germany. The meeting was presided over by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And that was during the era that we know as the scramble for Africa, when Britain, France, these are the major competing powers, said, listen, we fought many wars, and as we know, they've fought many more subsequent horrific wars, right? But if we are going to grab Africa, let's not fight amongst ourselves. Let's fight the Africans. So let's, gentlemen's agreement. Let's deal like gentlemen. So they met Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy. It was a late comer, Spain, and the colonial enterprise, right? And partitioned the continent. And basically, the era of formal colonialism ran from the 1890s to primarily the 1960s, when most African countries started winning independence. And then, of course, we have the exceptions, like the Portuguese colonies. Portugal, the poorest of the European countries, was not eager to let go of its colonial empire. And it took armed struggle in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau, to liberate the former Portuguese colonies. And then the holdout like Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia, which was basically Britain allowing European settlers in Zimbabwe to declare independence from Britain and set up another apartheid system, tolerated by the British, right? Something they could have crushed, in one day, but just landing a battalion of British expeditionary force, right? But the colonial empire was set up where African countries became producers of raw materials, whether they were crops, cotton, coffee, tobacco, tea, or whether they were mineral resources, gold, diamond, copper, and later uranium, coltan, cobalt. These are the more recent products. And that was one part. And the other part, they became consumers of European manufactured products. So they sold the ingredients used to make the products, and then they bought the ingredients that they didn't sell. I mean, it was during the colonial era, it was just plundered. They mined it or they produced it on the plantations. And then with the meager money that they were able were given, they were forced to become consumers of European manufactured products. That was the setup. And that setup lasted. And people would say, did that setup change after most of these countries won independence in the 1960s? No, that setup has not changed, right? In fact, that setup, I believe, is much more intensified now because, as Nkrumah actually said in his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, as colonial powers, they had some sort of obligation, right? Quote unquote. Okay, you're exploiting them. They're your colony, so you have some obligation. You could be questioned about some of the things that were happening in those colonies. But now they are governed by so-called independent African leaders.
Right.
So you can't question the former colonial powers, when in fact, they are the contemporary exploiters of Africa with a new system, where now you have the World Bank and the IMF as dangling the loans, the resources that they need to function their economies, and the absence of independent source of funding, they're going to go to the IMF or the World Bank. And these come with conditionalities, structural adjustment, which is a term that most people now understand. This is what you can do.
Explain that a little bit, though.
Okay, very good.
Please.
We are not giving you the loans unconditionally for you to deploy how you feel is best to be deployed to develop your economy. So if you feel like, let's say Zambia, for example, and we are one of the major producers of copper, and we know that we can produce not just the raw material, but actually manufactured products that come from copper. And that is why copper is so desirable in the global economy, right? So we would like to get a loan so we can actually create factories, right? So that now we have an integrated system. So I'm not just using one isolated resource or mineral. And then I'll give you another one for agricultural product. So now we are creating jobs in the mines, right? We're creating jobs transporting the raw material from the mines to the factories. Along the ways, business establishments are being created along the route where the products are being transported in order to get to the factories. In the factories, we now are employing skilled workers, Zambians, right? And in order to train them to become skilled workers, we may send some overseas. We may train some of them in Zambia, meaning we are creating institutions where they're getting trained, and we're creating jobs for the people that are teaching them. And once they're now qualified, we're creating jobs in the factories where they're now producing manufactured products. We produce manufactured products. We are now creating jobs for people that are going to be selling those range of products created from copper, right? So it's a successive, continuous multiplier effect, right? And now the surplus, we're either exporting some of it as raw material, or we actually can make much more money by exporting the manufactured products, right? And we're not competing on the world economy by selling so many items that can be made from this copper. And that's just one example of one product. And then let's go to agricultural commodity. I'm Kenya and I grow tea. I'm not selling it in huge sacks that are sent to Mombasa to be shipped to Germany and other countries, where they are then processed and put into these nice packages. And that by the time it's sold at Whole Foods, the price has multiplied by a factor of maybe 10 to 20 relative to that huge sack that the Kenyan is selling to the world market. I'm not doing it that way. I'm building the factories in Kenya to process the raw tea, to package it, and then sell it to the Whole Foods of the world. And that surplus is coming back to Kenya. It's not going to Germany, which is processing it and selling it. And if you do go to Whole Food and pick it up, you'll see tea, packages of tea, product made in Germany. You'll pick up chocolate, product made in Belgium. Belgium does not grow cocoa. Cocoa is grown in Ivory Coast and Ghana. So why can't Ghana and Ivory Coast make that surplus? And you multiply that on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on an annual basis. So you see how exploitation comes in many forms, right? But it starts by the World Bank and the IMF say, no, I don't want you, Zambia, building a factory. That's a waste of money because factories already exist in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, to make products from raw material. So that's not an efficient way. These are the things that you can do with this loan. So those conditionalities in the long run keep the African countries impoverished. So now we understand a little bit of how the system works. So now going back to how I started off, these were economies that were already weak anyway because of this dependent relationship that they have with the West. So now you have the COVID pandemic that's further weakened the economies. You mentioned the issue of tourism. Tourism is a major source of revenue. In fact, before the pandemic, it was the fastest growing industry in terms of employing people in Africa and predicted as a potential game turner going into the future. So that's, for the time being, has been wiped out. And who knows how long it will take to recover. So now we've dealt with the issue of the commodities. Now we've looked at tourism. Now let's look at investment. Investment, foreign direct investment, which was weak already anyway, but now that's completely wiped out as well. And now we go to the other issue that you also mentioned. So you had touched on a lot of the things that impact African economies as a whole. The debt issue, right? How are you going to be able to service those debts that were, in the case of Ethiopia, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in April, and he gave a number of almost between 25 to 30% of the country's income from exports goes to servicing the debt. And Ethiopia is actually one of the better performing countries in Africa. And he was saying how stressful this is and making the argument not only to extend the debt payment, but to actually cancel the debt. I think that's a strong argument that needs to be made. And even if that happens,
have Jubilee. We must.
I agree with you. Yeah. And even if that happens, the other challenges that we just went through still exist. And now let's go to the healthcare infrastructure that you also mentioned in the beginning of this segment. African, the tragedy is that if you have a neo-colonial relationship, this dependency relationship between Africa and the former colonial powers, and now the United States, and now with China as well, it means that you have a quote unquote willing partner on the African continent, right? And that willing partner is often the African president or prime minister. It's not the masses of the African population, of course, because if they had their way, they would not elect a person who does not represent their interests. But in many of these countries, people don't have a genuine choice when it comes to who becomes the leader in these countries. So often the most reactionary, backward leaders are the ones that are also sustained, by the West. And the most classic example was Mobutu, of course, in what was Congo. They're destructive. So how do we change that narrative post COVID to address this issue? Well, I think something might actually happen. And before I get to that, let me finish the point I wanted to make by bringing up these leaders in the first place. Look at what the leaders have done in the going to 60 years now that African countries have quote unquote been independent, right? Most of them are proud of the armed forces that they've built. So they have these, I don't know a single country that doesn't have these annual parades where the tanks are paraded, the jet fighters are flying overhead, the officers, salute, and the rulers salute the soldiers marching by, and they take pride in this. And they have a vested interest in that, right? Because that sustains the regime. But they cannot boast first-class medical facilities. You never see them parading their doctors, right? Their nurses, their healthcare professionals.
They're not like Cuba sending medical corps around the world.
Of course not. And in fact, that is why I brought this up, because I wanted to say that is the ultimate tragedy. It's very shameful that when we had the 2014 Ebola epidemic, it took tiny Cuba to send an army of healthcare workers and doctors to help stem this pandemic. And it did so very successfully. And now we'll come back on track to the healthcare thing in Africa, but let's go a bit further. It was Cuba, once again, that came to the rescue of Africa during the liberation struggle, right? When Cuba deployed up to 30,000, perhaps even more, soldiers in Angola to defeat Jonas Savimbi, who was the stooge of the CIA in South Africa, and to actually defeat a South African Expeditionary Army in Angola, which then, that was in 87, which led to the liberation of neighboring Namibia, which led to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, when the South African apartheid regime realized, wait a minute, we can actually lose this whole thing militarily. If Cuba ever decided to say, listen, we're going to support Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC's military wing, and get a few other African countries to maybe contribute 5,000 soldiers each, we can actually invade South Africa and just get rid of the apartheid regime. That thought must have crossed the minds of the folks running the regime. And that's why Africans that understand the history always praise Cuba and what Cuba has accomplished. But the importance of bringing up Cuba is to show how resources can be deployed in a disciplined and effective way when you have your priorities correct. So if your priority was building up state of the class healthcare infrastructure in African countries and transport and communication, that could have been accomplished too. With the same money, the billions and billions of dollars that's been deployed in the armed forces in African countries, right? So now let's come back to how is the continent going to evolve post-COVID? I would not be surprised if there's some regimes that collapse in African countries. Of course, if the West would have its way, they will try their best to sustain leaders that are beneficial. But it's going to be very difficult because you now have much more weakened economies, plus you have the African youth that are becoming increasingly more restless. Let's take an example of Uganda and South Africa. In Uganda, the population is one of the youngest in the world. I think close to 80% is below the age of 35. That's outstanding. And for the continent in general, I think more than 60% is below the age of 25. So now you cannot provide employment to them. And now many who were somehow operating in the so-called informal sectors, that's now disappeared because now tourism has collapsed. So you don't have all these tourists that create interrelated domestic economies. That's gone too. So their options are now narrowed, right, and non-existent in many places. They are going to become more restless. And I think at some point, increasingly, they may start taking matters into their own hands. I think we will see some of that. There's going to be a period where this issue is resolved. So the post-Africa, post-coronavirus Africa, is still, to me, unpredictable. I think it's going to be difficult to reestablish the neo-colonial regime as we know it today in Africa, especially when you have young people talking about becoming much more conscious, right? And understanding why Africa remains impoverished in the first place when you have a continent that perhaps has the richest in terms of natural resource endowment. So I think this is now another golden opportunity rising out of chaos, right? To steer Africa in a different direction. Will it happen? Of course, I hope it happens. But a number of things need to occur before it happens. I think in South Africa, it's good that you have like the people that support Julius Malema in terms of understanding that what we have in South Africa, and you mentioned that in the beginning of the show, is essentially what Steve Biko warned against. And there's a very interesting short interview. I think it's about 20 minutes long. If you go to YouTube and you put Steve Biko interview, that interview will come up. And he's talking about if we just change the color, right? We replace Europeans with Africans. It's going to be essentially the same without addressing the issue of land ownership and ownership of the means of production and the mining industry in South Africa. So South Africans are now, ANC is not talking so much about that, but I think...
And that's their own freedom charter. I mean, this
absolutely.
is in the ANC, right?
Right.
That's in the ANC. And, Ronnie Kasrils, who, one of my heroes, the great South African liberation fighter and communist, he served with, and Mandela and Mbeki, and he just said, it's the process of double liberation, and we haven't done the second part because of international, basically yes, because of international capital.